Yeah, it's time for another episode of the Free Thought Podcast. And today we have another special guest from the American Studies program, another student, and actually one of my first Padawans in the studies. I was actually, the first time I was a tutor in the American Studies program in my third semester, this guy came along and he was just worthy of becoming my Padawan. So welcome to you, Anas.
Thank you for having me. I was very pleased to be studying under you for those 2 weeks. It was quite an experience.
It sure was. And obviously, we also have Baba today to talk, and our producer Rasmus.
Well, he's not here to talk.
His silent presence is always comforting to us.
I hear he's a really good producer, though.
He's good. Okay, but he does his job.
And that's our money could afford.
Yeah. So, today, Anas, would you please explain to the listeners what you do in the American Studies program, or what you're doing right now?
Well, somewhat awkwardly, I'm actually not currently in the American Studies program. I'm studying communications, rhetoric, and whatever formidling is called in English. But, up to that, I just finished my bachelor, where I wrote about detente during the Cold War, and how the de-escalating effect really helped finish up that entire period of nuclear fear and nuclear proliferation, and and then I'm gonna do the masters in American Studies as well.
So you know what you're going to do the next couple of years.
I do.
Well, today's topic.
Owning the lips.
Well, today's topic is we're going to talk about neoliberalism. We're going to talk about the historic perspective on the topic, and we're also going to talk about the role neoliberalism has had in the world economy, and also the popularity of it, and the people who are starting to question the whole neoliberal theory. So, just to get it out with, let's just talk about our opinions on the neoliberal agenda. So, Baba,
I fucking hate it. I mean, I can't say much else than I hate it. I think it's such a backwards theory that doesn't factor anything into reality and have dire consequences for the vast majority of society, to be honest.
Yeah, what about you, Anas?
Well, I fucking love it. I think it's the most logical economic theory there is, and I think the idea of letting the consumers reward people who produce things that are useful or at least wanted. I think capitalism is the ultimate savior in regards to poverty, and utilizing the ideology that puts the free market, front and center. It's just, ignore that and, do so at your own peril. It's an amazing system, and I can't wait to defend it.
Yeah, and my personal opinion, I would call myself a skepticism of neoliberalism. I don't hate it. I realize that people who usually have this, a lot of people who have the neoliberal agenda actually wants the best for the society, and I can always respect that. But I'm always part of the people who always look at history. I want to learn from history and try to decipher what actually happened that caused certain problems, and that's where I'm a skeptic of neoliberalism, because I'm in favor of it for the most part, but in the extreme sense of neoliberalism, I can see that it has done more. It has created more problems than actually create solutions, and we're going to talk about this because I got my sources straight on this matter. So, to get a broad definition of neoliberalism, since Anas, you love it, can you please explain what neoliberalism is for those who is not aware of it?
Right, absolutely. So neoliberalism is not to be mistaken with neo-libs in American society, corporate Democrats. That's usually what we think about when we talk about, the neo-libs. But neoliberalism is essentially the idea that the free market should just, completely be completely unhinged and unimpeded, go forth and create essentially the economy, and then the government's role in said economy should be very limited, and eventually, the consumers will make the right choices. And if something's in demand, then the free market will create entrepreneurs and skilled laborers who will provide said product. And it's not limited to things like iPhones and cars, It's also medicine and agricultural equipment and so on and so forth. So
Just basic resources.
Just basic resources.
So yeah, and one important distinction I had to make when you were talking about why you love neoliberalism, it's really important to distinguish that neoliberalism isn't capitalism. It's a way that you try to. It's an undergenre of capitalism.
It's a capitalistic system.
Yeah.
And you can have a lot of different capitalistic systems.
Exactly.
I mean, in Denmark we also have a capitalistic system, but that's more social democratic capitalistic system, but it's still capitalism.
Yeah, sure.
I can accept that.
So that was an important distinction, because I'm a huge fan of capitalism, as
So
I think
am I.
everyone on the table can
Me too.
agree, because we're living so comfortably.
We're so lavishly living.
But that was an important distinction, and you're totally right. And when it comes to the neoliberal agenda, it is that the government should never intervene with the economy. It's basically like the economy will do its thing as long as you don't intervene. And that's where I think you and me, we are on different poles here, because
I don't agree with that at all.
Yeah.
Either. I'm probably more on Denne's side on this one.
More than mine? Dude,
A lot.
I thought you had my back, man. I'm
Hello.
really disappointed.
because we were at the Friday bar last Friday, and we had a beer, and we talked about this, and it became kind of tense, but
Oh,
we got,
come on. It didn't become tense.
Oh, I like it when it becomes tense, so it doesn't matter. But
And I had just quit smoking at the
Yeah.
given time, so, being
you
on
were-
edge was...
you have begun smoking again?
No.
Okay, sure. Okay.
Why does everyone assume that?
Because it was just last Friday, so it would be a surprise.
Oh, man. No. I'm pure steel.
Okay, so we had the definition, and let's get the historical perspective. So, obviously, neoliberalism is a continuation of classic liberalism from John Smith and his book, The Wealth of Nations, where he explains how the economy is something that shouldn't be intervened with, and the invisible hand, which is that the market itself will provide the necessary conditions for everyone to thrive. So just to lay it there. The classic liberalism had his downfall because of the Great Depression. Since then, it has become it has to be altered the point of view on the classic liberalism. But then afterwards, as a counter movement to the Marxist agenda, neoliberalism came along, where the communism and the neoliberalist agenda kind of conflicted, and it has been a conflict ever since, still to this day. So people are still debating whether or not which economic ideology is the best one.
And actually, I'm super glad you touched on that, because I think that's why I am so pro this libertarian, philosophy, is because I think if you just split up, let's forget about ideologies. Let's just think philosophically for a moment. If you take capitalism and then socialism, and all the branches of ideology stemming from capitalism versus all the branches of ideology stemming from socialism, I mean, I think it is indisputable that the ones that stem from capitalism are superior. And due to that fact, it just seems to me that until we have, I don't want to be crude, but until we have destroyed socialism as a legitimate form of government, until that date takes place where we look at socialism the same way you would look at Nazism, then I have to be a neoliberal, because I have to trumpet the cause of capitalism.
Well, I don't agree with almost anything of what you said. First of all, I will not say neoliberalism is the same as libertarianism. I think that's different things. It is in the same area economically, but there's still some differences that I would say that are pretty stark. I have more respect for libertarians than neoliberalism. And I will say the problem with your argument is that you're putting capitalism in one end and socialism in another end. I think it lacks a lot of nuances. It's not like you have to choose capitalism or socialism. I mean, in Denmark, we have a mixed system. We have a mixed economy. It's not that you either are pro-capitalist or pro-socialist. You can mix from best of both worlds. For example, I think healthcare should be a right from the government. I think people should... policing is also a socialist institution, if you will, because people pay taxes to get police and so on and so forth. All these things are a mixed economy. And to put it into a category where you're either pro-capitalism because that's better than socialism or pro-socialism, it removes all the nuances in this discussion and idea of how an economic system can work.
Yeah, and just to further prove Barbara's argument, when you look at history, anything that has to do with ideologies, we know that ideologies, they tend to give an answer to everything. Problem is, the different formulas are different, so you can't provide the same answer, and that's what I have seen constantly with the neoliberal agenda, where you have this idea that if you just leave the market alone, it will solve all the problems. That's pretty naive because we have seen it go wrong a lot of times now. Just like, I'm not a fan of Marxism either. We have seen numerous communist countries devour itself, if you can say so, and at the same time, we've also seen capitalism fail. It has to be altered, and that's why the neoliberal agenda have. If you look at the Great Recession in 2008, and if you look at the Great Depression in
1930s,
in the 1930s, you see that the capitalism has failed. It has, and it has to be altered, and the answers to those economic problems can be solved by one ideology. It lacks nuances.
I wouldn't disagree with that. So, since I'm in the hot chair against you two gentlemen, I wanna start out with Bobber here and be like, I agree with you that certainly you can have social programs in a capitalist society without being a socialist country. I completely agree with that. That's why I said I didn't want to be crude when I said destroy socialism. But I think if we want to get nuanced about it, then we also have to consider when we pay for policing, when we pay for healthcare. It is the private sector in the Scandinavian model that does that. So when we say it's a mixed economy, when we say it's like it's a mix of socialism and capitalism, it is actually social programs paid for on the back of capitalism. When we look, our entire economic philosophy is capitalistic. And with that in mind, I am saying that socialism and social programs are two different things. Because socialism is the idea that if the state owns the means of production, the state can pay for everything, living expenses, healthcare, policing, blah, 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 and, then everyone will be equal. Where in Denmark, we have the idea that under a free market, under a market economy, people can earn their paycheck, pay some of it in taxes, and then, essentially go pay for their hobbies or their cars or whatever they do recreationally. I'm completely in favor of that. What I am against is the idea that socialism as an economic philosophy, as a form of government, the idea that the state owning the means of production can somehow be superior to the idea of a market economy. So what I say is this: let people spend their money as they see fit. And, I think most would agree that social programs like policing and healthcare, now healthcare is a bit of a fuzzy issue for me. I'm a bit controversial on that one, but we'll get to that later, I'm sure. But as a starting point, I think people should be entitled to their own wealth, entitled to the fruits of their own labor. And socialism is in opposition to that idea, because socialism is the idea that the state owns the means of production. So I want to get that completely clear. When I say destroy socialism, I mean destroy the idea that we are not entitled to the fruits of our own labor.
Yeah.
So,
again, just to correct you, your talk of socialism is pure socialism. Yes. The way you're describing it, that's pure socialism. And yes, it has nothing to do with capitalism in its finest sense, if you talk about the market economy. But you have to remember that Denmark is a social democracy. Right. It is actually a mix, because you have the free enterprise, you have the free market, but you have a safety net under. That's the only difference between what you talk about when you're socialism and social democracy.
And what I disagree with you on is, again, this idea, as Dennis talked about, we're not advocating for socialism.
No.
We do believe in a market, free market place. But the problem is that, yes, you might pay taxes that go into a private industry, for example, healthcare. But the thing is, compared to America, they're not allowed to negotiate drug prices. And that's completely anti-capitalistic, but it is a neoliberal policy. You can say it's not a libertarian policy, and that's why I'm saying there's a difference between being a libertarian and a neoliberal, because this neoliberalism is where the free market is going to fix everything, basically. And when you cannot even, the government cannot even negotiate drug prices for drugs for people who need it and so on. That's not what I would call a capitalistic system. And that's the problem I have with your argument, is that you go from against socialism to the entire other end of the extremes, in my mind. I personally think that it needs to be some kind of mix, because you need to regulate some companies, or else they will do everything to maximize profits.
Exactly.
Because that's what companies are there for. And it's not because they're evil. I don't believe companies are evil. They're immoral. They do not have a moral system. They are there to maximize profit. And if they can get away with it in a system, they will do anything to maximize profit, no matter what harm it does to society, because that's their job, that's their function.
And just to talk about it, the neoliberal agenda, it usually have this idea that once you're in a free market economy and there are no regulations, that people... It's basically the neoliberal agenda. What it says is that if people can take care of themselves, they will also provide the greater good for the society. Well, that's not true, because we have seen it numerous times that just because that you have the liberty to do whatever you can to maximize your profit for yourself, it doesn't mean that it's for the greater good of the society. We have seen this numerous times, just with small things, just as when certain countries, they raise the tariffs because they can see a profit in it, that hurts other countries. So that's not for the greater good. We can agree on that, right?
Yeah.
Tariffs are bad?
No. I'm not saying tariffs is a good or bad thing.
Oh,
I'm
right.
saying if a certain country, for example, there was a certain case in a book I read for not so long time ago in the studies program, and because Mexico is highly reliant on corn, right? Because they use it for a lot of their... Yeah,
Why would
corn.
you say that, man? I'm not going to be able to contain myself on the jokes. I'm going to do them afterwards.
Yeah, sure. But, they need corn. They need corn for their tortillas and everything. It's really... it is true. It's true.
That was my joke, man. I was going to say that after the podcast. No, you stole it.
No, it's really true. If you look at the statistics, they are highly... It's really important that they have their corn. Right. Problem is they can produce all that corn by themselves. So yeah, the free market economy is really good because they can import it from other countries because of trade, right? But if a country like the U.S. suddenly, out of nowhere, decides to raise the tariffs on corn, then Mexico is screwed. So it's not a greater good for everyone. We can agree on that.
But does neoliberalism want to make tariffs? I mean, doesn't they believe in globalization and this world economy?
Yeah, they do.
I would believe that they wouldn't want it to waste tariffs on other countries, such as, for example, Donald Trump did with China on steel.
Yeah.
I would imagine neoliberals are against that. And that's even one of the points where I'm not necessarily disagree with neoliberals. My problem with them is that this entire idea that everything can be solved through the free market, I think is so naive, because companies do not exist to try to promote welfare, promote the greater good. They do only exist to earn money.
Yeah, my point was the contradiction, because the free market, in the free market economy, a company can do whatever it likes to. Maybe a company is free to raise the tariffs, but it's against the neoliberal agenda. But the neoliberal agenda also says you can do whatever you want to.
Indeed, and you know, I certainly wouldn't be so unwise as to make the suggestion that huge corporations are, you know, benevolent in their nature, because they're not. What I would counter, though, is that essentially, in order to maximize profits, at least in most cases, you need to, you know, pander to the consumer at hand. If I'm running a grocery store, then the way I maximize profits is to make sure that people would want to come back because I have favorable pricing and good service and so on and so forth. And thereby I'm producing something to my community that's of need, and at the same time, maximizing my profits, and thereby, you know, being forced, I'm making air quotes, forced to you know, to be altruistic, essentially. I would prefer to charge, you know, $10 for a milk, but unfortunately no one's going to buy my milk if I do that, so I have to sell it at, you know, $2. But if I try to be greedy, or, you know, if I'm trying to cheat my customers, then the free market is going to kill me. So
well, what I think here, and what you're talking a lot about, and of course that makes sense, that's basically just the free market.
It's just supply and demand.
What I think the problem here is that you're applying this idea to things that are necessities versus things that are more, you can call them sort of luxury items, these necessities and luxury items, for example, you can talk about grocery, everybody wants grocery, and the more grocery you buy, the more companies also will try to put the price as low as possible, and there's also luxury items as in phones, they are always in competition. I think that's a good thing, but then there's some other system where neoliberalism also thinks it should be privatized, and one of the things that I made an exam paper about was private prisons.
Yeah.
And I do not believe that companies should go in and privatize prison to profit over other people's misfortune. And the entire idea about it is, and I understand the idea, it's not because there's not a logical economic argument to be had, but the idea is that private companies can be more streamlined and so cut prices are expensive at some areas, so it's less expensive to have a private prison, one person facility, than a public prison, because they're always trying to lower costs as much as possible. But it also has some dire consequences. That means that people that are working there do not get a fair wages, so they cannot contribute to society because their wages are so low that they have to live on food stamps. Then you are doing a negative impact. And the irony about all this private prison industry is that it's still paid by tax money. I mean, what's the point of paying tax money to a private prison when it has worse consequences than a public one? The jobs are horrible.
Yeah, also, just to summarize, what Barbara is trying to say is that the neoliberal agenda tries to say that as long as you're benefiting yourself, it's greater cost to the society. But again, all of those examples Barbara made, it has shown that when people get to control more of what they can do, it's not always for the best of the society, like with the private prisons, with the mass incarcerations, ever since it was privatized. So,
and I completely, unadulterated, agree with that. The idea of private prisons is ridiculous, but it's actually ridiculous for all the ideologies presented at this table. It's ridiculous for me personally because, as you say, you know, tax dollars are, you know, being used as incentives to create private prisons. And to me, that's insane because then you're no longer talking about, you know, that sweet world capitalism that I like. Then you're talking about corporatism, in which, you know, the state says, okay, cool, you know, here's X amount of dollars, go build us some prisons, make them some food, and obviously you're going to profit on people being incarcerated. That's insane. And furthermore, one more point, the state are the ones throwing people in jail. So surely the state should provide the standard of prisons. I completely agree. Prisons should not be a market. It shouldn't be a business on the market, and that's due to the fact that it's simply state business. Incarcerating and maintaining incarceration should be state business.
Yeah.
So I agree with you in that industry.
But from a neoliberalism point of view, it doesn't go against it, because you believe in this idea that they can provide the same service as the public sector can, but for lower cost. That's the entire idea about it. I will argue that it doesn't work. It's not because that private prisons sometimes can be this boogeyman where they're getting treated horrible and so on, but it does create a lot of problems where you more focus on cutting cost, and people who are working in these facilities are getting paid a lot less. So in a neoliberal, it is the free market having a solution that the public sector can. And that the problem I have with neoliberalism is that the idea that the private market can fix all solutions in society, the free market can fix everything. It's just not possible. Some things should not be up to the free market. Some things should be up to the people of the state. I mean, you might disagree with healthcare, but I believe prisons should be government controlled. I believe healthcare also should be under government regulation at least. Police, fire department, the military, and neoliberalism also love the military. They normally put an insane amount of money into the military. I mean, one of the most famous neoliberals in our lifetime is Dick Cheney. And he is a neoliberal, but in my view, he is the worst president in U.S. history. I know he's was only vice president, but for my taste, he was the worst president.
Yeah, I mean, just to come with an interesting statistic, when privatization actually equals corruption, there's a line. Those two lines usually go with each other, and that's a very interesting statistics that I ran into, because that definitely goes against the assumption that the neoliberal ideology is actually for the greater good. So just to throw in there, couldn't have said it better than Barbara.
Well, I think when we're talking about neoliberalism and the lack of intervention on the part of the state, I think it's difficult to look at a guy like Dick Cheney or the actual president George Bush, and look at their administration and say, look at that libertarian-esque lack of intervention. I mean, that administration really broadened the scope of federal governments. I mean, much more so than Bill Clinton did. And I think, just to get back, I know I'm a bit late to the party in that one, but to get back to the definitions, what I am for is the idea that, we promote the free market, we promote capitalism as much as possible, and then, we get the state. I'm not an anarchist. I'm not I'm not an anarchist. I believe in a state. I believe in borders. I believe in police, and I believe in a somewhat centralized government. But I believe all of this should happen on the back of the free market. And Dick Cheney and George Bush, they blew up the deficit. They increased federal money for schooling, for the military, for ICE.
They created ICE.
Oh, right, they created ICE, and thereby, added to the deficit. So to me, they weren't deficit hawks. They weren't free market guys. They were essentially, a really corrupt version of conservative, compassion, essentially, in which they're saying, no, we are small government, but we're gonna oversee everything. So Dick Cheney was just like, he was just like a fascistic faux Republican.
I agree with what you're saying in the sense that they're sort of hypocrites and they care about the deficit, but they blew up the deficit. And I completely agree with all of those points. My point is more that from their ideological standpoint, I will say it is neoliberalism, because they believe that giving the power to the private industry, the free market, they will fix the solution. And that's where I have an issue. For me, it more sounds like you are a libertarian more than you actually are a neoliberalist.
Well, as I said, just to get back to the start of it, I think in Danish terms, I'm what you would call a neoliberalist.
Yeah.
I suppose. Yeah. And I think that would roughly translate to a libertarian. because, like on foreign policy, for example.
Well,
like,
it's usually a problem when comparing the different
True.
definitions from American politics to Danish politics.
Yeah, because the spectrum is just so,
Yeah.
it's two very different.
The classic example, liberal in Denmark is the party to the
liberal.
right. Yeah, exactly. Whereas on the other party is on the left. So,
But it's also due to the fact that, we'll get back on topic real quick, but it's also due to the fact that Americans change the meaning of words so often.
that's so true.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's because that, Franklin D. Roosevelt came up and went like, no, that isn't being liberal. That isn't being liberty-loving. This is liberty-loving.
True.
And then his oppositions were like, well, then we're definitely not liberals. Then we're conservatives. And then...
Yeah, he changed the whole notion of what freedom is, because
Exactly.
freedom before that was to be reliant on your own. But then Roosevelt comes along, and then he says, well, freedom is to do exactly what you are able to do.
Indeed, and what you're left with is the idea that if you go to America, if you go to like Dayton, Ohio, and you say, I'm a liberal, and then someone else says, I'm a classical liberal, then you're on each side of the spectrum, and that is so weird.
That's confusing.
I hate the term classical liberal. It has been butchered so much over the last 4 or 5 years. But people are now starting to call them classical liberals are just libertarians.
Yeah, pretty much.
But they do not want to identify with libertarians, so they call themselves classical liberals. So I couldn't agree more with they completely butcher the terminology all the time in America and what it means, and changes the meaning of the terminology all the time.
It's like saying collateral damage. It's just the collateral damage was very high. Yeah, it's just another sentence for saying that you killed a lot of people.
Enhanced interrogation.
Yeah, enhanced interrogation.
Oh yeah, did you guys know Ben Shapiro actually still says that?
Does it?
Yeah, he's like
What does he say?
enhanced interrogation when someone's like, you're anti-torture, right? He's like, of course I am. And then like, what about waterboarding? That's not torture.
Yeah, like he knows.
It is torture.
Like he knows.
Have you about waterboarding? Have you ever seen? I think it's a guy called Mancow who was a conservative radio host who believed that waterboarding was not torture. So he decided to try it on himself. You can look it up on YouTube. He couldn't. It took like 5 seconds. He was like, "I can't anymore. This is torture."
Did he? And then he actually changed his tune and was
Changed
like,
the tune
respect,
instantly.
respect. I
So
really
he's
like
not a
that.
complete idiot. He was just ignorant.
But that was also in 2005 or something. So there was still this 9/11 fear
Yeah,
on
sure.
a high pitch. But he totally didn't believe that pouring water over people was torture. So he decided to try to prove it wasn't torture, and he instantly flipped and said, "No, that's torture."
I mean,
So, yeah.
you
gotta respect
yeah, exactly. You gotta respect that he didn't just sit in his studio and was like, nope, it's not torture, and I'm not trying it, and that's that.
If I wanted to, I could have done it longer.
Anyway, to get back on track, I think I would in American terms. So forget everything we said about American terms being useless, because I'm going to use one now. In American terms, I would probably be called a libertarian. But what I really want to stretch is I am not an anarchist. I do believe in the legitimacy of having a state.
Yeah, sure.
And that, of course, includes policing and the military and so on. But I know Denne has been looking forward to this. We obviously got to talk about
Healthcare. Because that's where we completely gone off track. Because you're not in. You don't like when government is intervening. Am I correct?
Generally
in the
speaking, yes.
Economy, and you don't like healthcare. I mean, where
Dude, I love healthcare. I'm a big fan.
but there's a certain limit.
Here's the problem. I actually feel kind of horrible for saying this, and I think I'm a recovering libertarian in that sense. I have a difficult time ignoring the fact that when you look at medicine and surgical procedures and so on and so forth, it is the most free market-based healthcare systems that have provided the best solutions. Things like, insulin, or if you want to take it even lower, like just, aspirins and so on and so forth. The triple bypass. All these, quote-unquote profitable, greedy healthcare systems have really benefited the quality of healthcare in the entire Western world, and I think America is the it's kind of the magnum opus of it, as it were. And I take issue with the idea, and this is why it's controversial. I take issue with the idea that it's the bad intent on behalf of the medicinal industries somehow corrupts the result. If you look at something like insulin, a lot of diabetic people have gotten a lot better due to this specific medication, and a lot of people have gotten bonkers rich, like unbelievably rich. And I can't look at that and be like, oh, I can't believe these foul businessmen, profiting on the backs of sick people. And I'm like, well, yeah, I guess that's what they do. But if the result is that there's affordable medicine that helps huge legions of people, then, we're all the better for it. And I'm skeptical towards the idea that in a state of socialized medicine, the medicinal patterns, the surgical procedures, the surgical equipment, and so on and so forth would be enhanced. Now, you may dragon-fire me.
So, we talked about this Friday.
We did.
And again, it's the distinction I have to correct on, because what you're saying is, of course, the American technological wonders when it comes to medicine has been absolutely brilliant. There's no other ways to say it. The creation of insulin, triple bypass, all these kind of things, they are really medical breakthroughs that usually you can't be anything but grateful for, right? But there's a distinction between the medical technology, which is the U.S. is brilliant at, and the healthcare system that they use. Because what you're talking about is the
industry.
The industry has had a very positive influence on the Western Hemisphere, but the healthcare system has nothing to do with other healthcare systems in the Western Hemisphere. So you can't say that they have the healthcare system itself has benefited the other countries. And my criticism when it comes to the U.S. regarding the healthcare is the healthcare systems, not the technology. So that's where we have to go, and the reason for why is because people have a lot of problems when it comes to the healthcare, because of the health. There's a lot of flaws in the American healthcare system.
Agreed, completely agreed. By the way.
Yeah, and you sent me the statistics regarding this. So where?
Damn it.
Yeah.
Why did I do that?
And you said you were converted, so I was disappointed to hear this. But
no.
But
He's lying. I'm a man of steel. I haven't changed my mind since I was 6 years old, and I'm not going to change it ever. So anyway, guys.
I will make another argument for nationalizing healthcare or Medicare for all, if you will. The problem with healthcare in the American system is that it's privatized, and most people who live in a middle class or lower middle class income, if they do not have health insurance, it's impossible for them to pay their own medicine if they get some kind of disease that needs medication, because medication is expensive. And as you probably know, before Obamacare, we had the pre-existing condition, which means that you couldn't get health insurance if you had a pre-existing condition. For example, if you had cancer once and the cancer came back, they would just say, no, you have already had a cancer, that's a pre-existing condition, you have to pay it for yourself. That's a death sentence.
Indeed, and actually, it even cancer is a big one. Like, they could go even lower before Obamacare. They could go to like C-section and be like, "Is that a C-section? Please,
exactly,
pay for your own damn treatment." That's
that is crazy.
Which is obviously nuts. But I would counter this. Okay, first of all, just to clear the air, this Friday I made the somewhat silly claim that healthcare really wasn't that big an issue.
He said, just to put in word, I said this to Casper too. We said this to Casper too, that healthcare is necessary. It's a really pretty necessary for a society to function.
Yes.
It can't really function without healthcare.
It was
the
biggest political issue in the midterms. That was healthcare. Yes.
And obviously, confessing isn't as gratifying as I thought it would be. But yeah, upon some research done, I actually discovered that healthcare is the number one bankrupter
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
Americans.
Yeah.
And I did not know that this last Friday. I know that now, and obviously that it does change my view drastically. But I will be stubborn and say that I think one of the huge problems are the insurance companies. It's essentially the insurance companies licensed by the different states that say, okay, you guys go out and, you tell who can get covered, who can't get covered. It's not the doctors saying that, dude, fuck off. It's there are definitely some less than favorable corporations in this. And that's what I mean by recovering libertarian on healthcare. Because I have to admit that the insurance companies, I think, are a net negative for the American healthcare system. Now, when you look at something like eye surgery or plastic surgery or, not non-essential surgery or non-essential medical work, if you will, America is doing a great job. But I will move this to the left. I will say this. Since we do have a police force, and since we do have a military, and since we are enforcing the border, I do believe that in life or death situation, if you get cancer, or if your stomach gets those weird things, I can't remember what they're called, which.
Is it something that happened to you?
No. What? No. I have a very healthy diet. I eat a cucumber every day. But my point is this. I do think that if there is a medical emergency in which a citizen stands to lose their life, if it is not dealt with, then yes, I do believe the state should intervene.
First of all, I would say I actually also used to be extremely libertarian-leaning when I was around 18 years old. And it was actually...
But you grew up.
I grew up. No, but it was actually the healthcare issue that kind of changed me. And for me personally, it opened sort of my... Because as we talked about before we started Ron Paul, I really like that guy. But I think it has a lot of blind spot. Because this idea with the free market can fix everything, and you're talking about the insurance companies that are negative. The problem with insurance companies, what else are they supposed to do? Yeah. It's a company. They need to earn money somehow. And how they earn money is to deny healthcare, because that's the business. So that's the problem with this entire privatized healthcare system. And I will even argue from an economic perspective is that if you got Medicare for all, the lower and middle class Americans are going to pay less than they're doing for health insurance, and they do not have to worry about these things, which mean they can spend more money in the economy, and they are the people who are boosting the economy, because it's not billionaires do not run out and get 200 haircuts a day. It's not possible.
Well, they do get very expensive haircuts, though.
That's true. That's true. But my point is, there's so much of these necessities that billionaires can buy. Therefore, also, for example, like a bed or something, that's something that the middle class has to have money for, to use to this industry to survive, because that is where the largest part of the economy is. So if you can remove the cost for them for healthcare, and that you do not have to worry about this, also just about the stress about healthcare, I believe it will be a net positive. And there have even been some studies that have said that if America goes over to a Medicare for all system, they will actually save money over a 10-year period than they are using on healthcare right now.
Yeah, also just to add this, what Bob says is true. A huge middle class, a wealthy middle class, usually results in a lot of money in circulation, because they spend so much money in the economy that and a functioning economy is an economy where there's a lot of money in circuit. And by that definition of a functioning economy, it explains why the Great Depressions, the Great Recessions have happened, because there hasn't been a lot of money in circuit.
And I'm not going to sit here and say that billionaires, get 200 haircuts a day. Though that you can do some pretty cool things when you're rich. Have you seen that guy who got like a golden-plated swimming pool? And then his
That sounds tacky as fuck.
Dude, it's terribly tacky. But what I loved about it was that then his congresswoman, who's a social democrat, was like, "Oh my God, look at this obscene display of wealth." And then he just went through like all the people he'd hired, you know, all the engineers who had been in on it, all the people who had been paid essentially to create this tacky, obscene.
Was that Alexander Cortez?
No. It was in California somewhere. Anyway, that's not the point. The point is this: that sorry, what were we talking about?
Well, we were talking about when the middle class is
right. Yes. Anyway, so I completely agree, and I think that's why it's so, you know, heartwarming to see poverty being on the decline for the third year in a row. Consumer confidence is extremely high, and Americans, as a general rule, spend a lot of money. I mean, at least compared to like Scandinavians, they certainly, you know, they live paycheck to paycheck, like 67% of them or something like that, might be even higher. Like there aren't a lot of savings. There's a lot of consumerism, and generally, I think that's why their free market is so innovative. Is because that, you know, in America, if you create something that's, you know, nice and profitable and accessible, then you're gonna get rich. And I think that's why that's also why I'm a bit skeptical towards the whole Medicare for all thing, because if you do it like you do in Denmark, then essentially, well, two issues actually. First of all, the federal government should not guarantee healthcare. That would be like if the European Union guaranteed healthcare. I would be more sympathetic if you said that each of the 50 states should make their own form of Medicare for all.
Are you talking sort of like a public options you can go in and out of?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the public option. I kind of would prefer if we had a public option here in Denmark, so that people who are capable of paying for their own healthcare could do so.
I don't think that's a good idea at all.
I don't agree.
That's not a good idea at all.
No one seems to agree with that. I'm pretty sure if the producer could talk, he would agree.
Personally, I don't agree with it, but I can kind of respect that point of view, and I kind of understand it. But I will say about the poverty have declined, sure, but the inequality in America is now bigger than it was before the 2008 recession. And for one of the examples I've just made, from the U.S. Board of Governors of Federal Reserve, they have made a study in May 2018 that shows that 40% of Americans cannot afford a $400 unexpected expense. They cannot afford that without either lending money from family or get it from somewhere else.
Or they have to sell their own stuff, like cars
exactly.
or houses.
$400 is not
That's pretty
that's
crazy.
not a lot.
In order to pay for your own health, you have to sell certain stuff that you're relied upon. That's pretty.
Or just your car broke down.
Yeah.
I mean, $400 is not a lot, and that's 40% of Americans who cannot do that out of own pocket. They need to lend money from somewhere or sell some stuff.
Also talking about, you know, just the minimum wage in general hasn't risen for middle class or lower class since like the 1980s. It's been crazy.
It's been a long time, and I'm disheartened to hear that. I hope these families who can't afford these $400, you know, don't end up having to make, you know, these terrible choices. However, I will say this about the whole minimum wage thingy. I generally, when it comes to the minimum wage, when it comes to income inequality, for me, you got to look at the standard of living. If we're dealing with a situation in which the 1% keeps getting wealthier and the 99%, you know, keeps getting poorer, and, you know, and their lives are essentially on the decline. If the average American family is suffering while the 1% is thriving, then we have a problem. However, not just American, but Western standard of living for the median household is extremely high.
I can't compare the rest of the West to the U.S. because also when you look at, you're saying that they are all getting richer.
Oh yeah,
that's what you're saying. Yes. But that's not true, because the middle class is declining. How would you explain something like that?
You also have to think about inflation. I mean, you can maybe get more monies, but that doesn't mean that inflation have kept up with the wages.
I completely agree. That's why I'm against the national debt. I think the national debt is the single greatest threat to the American system right now.
What does that have to do with inflation?
Because every time, you know, the Fed prints money, the buying power of the American dollar devalues.
Sure, but inflation is also a good thing. Inflation is a natural thing. The problem is when inflation gets out of control.
Yeah.
I mean, we all know about the case in Germany before World War II,
Yeah.
where inflation was completely out of control. But a small percent of inflation happens every year. And that means, for example, I believe it was from 45 after World War II to around 70 or something. Because of inflation and the productivity in America, the economy grew like, I don't remember the number because it's, 2 semesters since I had business now. But it was grew like 5 times or something. And inflation is not a bad thing. It's out of control inflation.
When you
that's a
say
bad
the
thing.
economy grew, do you mean the GDP grew or the median household income grew? Or?
Both of them. The GDP, of course, grew a lot, but the median household also grew enormously. That's also why there's so many people, except, of course, African Americans, who look at the 50s as the golden age of America.
Yeah.
Right, but if you look at the 50s versus today, like,
It's much worse today.
what?
I explained that to you.
But I still disagree with you because I think your explanation lacks legitimacy in the fact that if you were to ask someone,
It's because
anyone,
you're not taking the difference between the dollars,
I'm-
the currency of dollars.
what I'm saying is this: if you could decide for yourself, if you could point at a time where, like, when was the American dream alive and well? When could you rely on having a good life no matter your standing in the world? Then you would not go to the 1950s America. Then you would go to 2019 America.
But that-
No, I don't think if you're white, I actually believe you would go back to the 1950s. But
if you're
black,
white?
Yeah,
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 because
definitely.
civil rights were a thing before the 60s.
You never heard of racial matters during the 50s?
Guys, I don't think white people would be like, oh yeah, I want to go
What
back
I'm
to
saying
the
is that-
50s when I could be openly racist.
No, that's not what I'm saying.
no, that's not what I'm saying.
that's not
Oh,
what I'm
I
saying.
thought that was
I'm
the
saying-
argument you
no,
were
no,
making.
no.
That was
What I'm saying is white
scary.
people had it better economically compared to now in the 50s. If you compare with the inflation. But you cannot put black people into that category because the civil rights didn't exist at that point. That's my point.
I mean, they might have been, if for the comparative times, they might have been better off as working class white. But a working class white had enormous issues back then that he would never face today. You would have work safety standards were abhorrent. You didn't. A refrigerator was unbelievably expensive. Cars were unbelievably expensive. If you look at the standard of living, and that's what I'm talking about, the standard of living today for the average American. I mean, having a microwave is a standard thing now. Having cable is a standard thing now. So whether or not you were off better compared to other ethnic groups really seems at a moot point because in the 1950s you were faced with huge problems.
But that's not true either, because if you think about it, especially when you're talking about cars, that was where at the time when people really started innovating. I believe even before World War II, we started innovating in a way where you produce cars, so that's, the Ford, the manufacturing assembly line. The entire idea here was that Ford, he also wanted people who works in his assembly line to be able to buy his cars.
Yeah.
So most people working at around that time, they could afford it. But the difference is, sure, I'm not saying that we don't have it better in a lot of areas today. Of course we do. I mean, technology have advanced extremely.
And there's the free market, my friend.
Sure, I'm not against the free market in that sense. My point is, if you look at other aspects, young people from our age and up to the late 30s, it's almost impossible for them today to buy housing in America. There's a huge housing crisis in America. So sure, you might say that we have iPhones, we have microwaves, but if you cannot find a profitable or proper place to live you can afford, you have some pretty big issues in society, because that's a pretty huge place you need to have under control. I mean, the house is where you spend most of your time when you're not at work. You need that for safety.
I think also there's a problem with that. You're talking about standard of living. That's when you just can buy a lot of things. but
Yes, and have access to a lot of things.
access to a lot of things, right? But people didn't have access to those kind of things because it was the 50s and 60s. That's why there wasn't a lot of access to those things.
I completely
But the
agree.
things that were access to, they could easily buy without trouble. And that's not true today.
I mean, I would, first of all, that assembly line, I mean, working on that assembly line at Ford's factories were
Terrible working
It was
conditions.
terrible. Yeah, sure.
terrible working conditions. And you know, the idea that, everything was just so affordable, the agricultural technology used in the 1950s, you know, compared to today, where you can buy like the most amazing organic products, and at affordable rates, might I add. I mean, yes, it's true. Obviously, they didn't have in the 1950s available to them what they have today. I completely agree. But my argument is that the free market has an innovation in the free market has made it so that essentially you don't have to be very wealthy in America to feel wealthy in America. And to the housing idea right there, I mean, if you look at a place like Montana, you can buy a farm in Montana for like $100,000. If you look at a place like, what's it called, that weird desert? Arizona, that's it. If you are outside of Las Vegas, Nevada, I'm sorry. Oh, that's so embarrassing. If you're outside of Las Vegas, in the state of Nevada, your housing is affordable. It's in like urban areas where housing has gone insane. You know, New York, Los Angeles, Detroit, Dallas, you know, it's all these really big cities where apartments have become, you know, unaffordable, which is a big deal for young people because there are a lot of colleges there. But housing
Jobs are in cities.
And the jobs are in cities. But you know, we're moving towards a place where a lot of the I'm so tired. Sorry, guys. Where a lot of the productivity happens on a laptop, and I could imagine that in like 10 years, maybe people just work from home.
Well, to go back to the neoliberalism's idea and just sort of wrap this up, my final point I will say is that I believe it was a Princeton study who made a study of looking at Americans' productivity compared to their earnings or wages. And the productivity have skyrocketed throughout the time, also from the 70s to today. But the earnings have stagnated when you adjust for inflation. That means that even though they work more efficiently or harder, if you will, they do not get the same amount of money as they did before. Before, productivity and wages, they sort of grew together. But since the 70s, it have been inflation and the productivity have sort of, the wages have stagnated while the productivity have risen. And that I will argue that is because of neoliberalism, because of Ronald Reagan, who came out with this new idea. And the problem I have with neoliberalism is that it makes everyone switcher of the top. And the idea is that it will trickle down to the lower Americans, and that just doesn't happen. That's my final point.
I cannot believe you went after my boyfriend, Ronald Reagan.
I mean, we could spend another hour talking about that.
Yeah, we'll have to do that next time. Then it'll be Reaganomics.
Because that one, I can definitely destroy that theory.
Dennis hates Ronald Reagan.
He does, and he actually explained to me why. And now that I know that he caused the crack epidemic, you know, I mean, I have been thinking about breaking up with him, but you know,
I would have broken his jaw if I could. But that's another topic.
You're tweeting a president.
Well, that was our topic for today. Unfortunately, we didn't talk about the Great Depression and the recession that much, but that's what I was looking forward to. But maybe sometimes in the future. So
we didn't talk about income inequality. Well, a little bit.
Yeah,
a little bit. Damn.
It is a broad topic.
It is a broad topic.
Well, I would like to thank you for being a guest. It was a great conversation.
It was so much fun, guys.
Yeah. So next week it's with Sabine.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about the LGBTQ versus religious freedom, where we're going to talk about the conflict between those two sides. So that's going to be interesting.
That sounds like a lot of fun. Thanks for having me on, guys.